They came bearing crosses and muskets, promising salvation, delivering suffering. In the name of God, ancient temples burned. In the name of grace, native tongues fell silent. This is the untold story of how faith became a weapon and how it reshaped the souls of two continents. They did not arrive alone. When Spanish ships cut through the Caribbean in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they carried more than steel, gunpowder, and ambition. They carried crosses. Side by side with conquistadors came men in robes, armed not with swords, but with scripture. These were the missionaries, Franciscan friars, Dominican preachers, and later, Jesuits. Their goal was clear: convert the souls of the heathen natives. Their methods, however, would entangle salvation with subjugation. In the earliest days of conquest, priests often celebrated the discovery of new peoples as a divine opportunity. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were seen as blank slates, noble savages perhaps, but unbaptized and therefore outside the kingdom of God. It was the moral duty, they believed, of Spain to bring them into the fold. Evangelization wasn't just encouraged by the crown, it was expected. Missionaries were considered spiritual pioneers, claiming souls for heaven, even as soldiers claimed land for the empire. The famous voyages of Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro were accompanied by men like Father Olmedo, who offered Mass after battles, baptizing the wounded, both Spanish and indigenous, while villages still smoldered. The paradox was striking: mercy amidst a massacre. Wherever a cross was planted, it often stood beside a sword. The Spanish conquest was never purely military endeavor. It was spiritual warfare, cloaked in conquest. For every fort built, there was a chapel raised. And while some missionaries showed genuine compassion for indigenous people, others saw them as obstacles to Christian order, wild, superstitious, and dangerously pagan. The process of Christianization became part of the machinery of colonization. Religion gave moral cover to expansion, converting genocide into salvation and colonizers into redeemers. The rituals of conquest were infused with religious symbolism. In many cases, as soon as a land was claimed in the name of the Spanish crown, a priest would hold a ceremony consecrating it to God. A cross would be raised. Mass would be said. The soil, the rivers, the mountains, all now belonged to Christendom, and by extension, to Spain. But this spiritual conquest was not bloodless. Resistance was met with threats of eternal damnation or death. In 1513, Spain issued the infamous Requerimiento, a document read aloud in Spanish, often to non-Spanish-speaking natives, that declared all lands and people subject to the Catholic monarchs. If the indigenous did not accept Christianity, violence would be justified in the name of divine right. Thus began a centuries-long entanglement between faith and force, where the gospel was not merely preached, but enforced, where religion offered both hope and horror, and where the missionary and the conquistador walked the same path, each claiming to save what the other destroyed. Before steel swords slashed across empires and native tongues were silenced by royal decrees, a quieter war had already begun. One waged in cathedrals and courtrooms, in scrolls of theology and papal bulls. This was the War of Justification. How could a Christian empire, one that spoke endlessly of mercy, salvation, and divine love, justify the destruction of entire civilizations? The answer lay in the theological scaffolding built by Europe's influential minds to sanctify colonization. At the heart of this structure was a single premise: God's truth was universal. Therefore, any people who had not yet embraced Christianity were either ignorant or rebellious. If they accepted the gospel, they were to be welcomed. But if they resisted, then conquest became not only permissible, but righteous. In 1493, just 1 year after Columbus's first voyage, Pope Alexander VI issued the Inter Caetera. This papal bull effectively granted Spain dominion over newly discovered lands, provided that the Spanish monarchs committed to spreading Christianity. This was not merely a land grab, it was cloaked in divine purpose. Spain would conquer in the name of faith. Colonization became a crusade, and native lands became fields for harvest, not of crops, but of souls. One of the earliest and most influential theological frameworks for conquest was developed by the Spanish jurist Francisco de Vitoria in the early 1500s. A professor at the University of Salamanca, Vitoria asked hard questions. Did indigenous peoples have rights? Were they sovereign? Was Spain justified in waging war to convert them? His answers were both progressive and damning. Vitoria concluded that native peoples did have rights. They had laws, customs, and a system of governance. They could not be enslaved or killed merely for being non-Christian. But, and here was the trap, if they resisted evangelization, or if they interfered with Spain's natural right to preach the gospel, then Spain could declare war. In other words, indigenous sovereignty existed until it got in the way. Even more chilling was the use of natural law to enforce religious doctrine. According to this thinking, all people, regardless of culture, were subject to the same moral laws. To reject Christianity wasn't just a religious decision, it was a violation of reason and order. Resistance became rebellion. Rebellion demanded punishment. This thinking gave rise to the Requerimiento, drafted in 1513. It was a bizarre ritual. Spanish conquistadors would arrive at a native village and read a legal document, in Castilian Spanish, that explained Spain's divine right to claim the land, its authority through the Pope, and the demand for immediate submission. The document stated that if the indigenous people accepted Christianity, they would be protected. But if they refused, Spain would unleash war, enslavement, and ruin. And their suffering would be their own fault. Most native communities had no idea what was being read to them. Many didn't speak Spanish. Some heard the proclamation only after attacks had already begun. But to the Spanish, the mere act of reading it was enough to make the conquest legal and spiritually clean. In this fusion of theology and empire, violence was baptized. To some friars and priests, this deeply troubled their conscience. One of the most powerful dissenting voices was Bartolomé de las Casas, a former conquistador who had become a Dominican friar. He witnessed the brutality firsthand in Hispaniola and became a relentless critic of Spanish cruelty. Las Casas argued that indigenous people were fully human, rational, and capable of receiving the gospel peacefully. He begged the crown to stop forced conversions and violent conquest. In 1550, a remarkable debate unfolded in Valladolid, Spain, the Valladolid debate, between Las Casas and Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, another influential scholar. Sepúlveda argued that native peoples were inferior, naturally servile, and required domination to be civilized. Las Casas countered with theology and eyewitness accounts, demanding justice and gentleness. While Las Casas won moral victories and helped inspire reforms, the machinery of empire continued to operate. The theology of conquest was too valuable, too profitable, and too embedded in Spanish policy to be abandoned. The Church continued to send missionaries, often well-intentioned, into territories already broken by steel and fire. The theological justification of conquest wasn't just a Spanish phenomenon. It became a blueprint for other empires too. The idea that Christianity gave license to dominate shaped centuries of imperial expansion across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Missionaries and muskets marched together, and long after the empires crumbled, the scars remained in broken cultures, erased languages, and ancestral trauma. What makes this theology especially haunting is that it claimed to serve the highest good. Its architects were not warlords, but scholars. Its weapons were not always swords, but scripture. And its victims were not only bodies, but entire worldviews. As the 16th century progressed, the theology of conquest would be challenged again and again by indigenous resistance, by Jesuit experiments in humane evangelization, and by the growing moral crisis within the church itself. But by then, the damage was deep, and the souls of 2 continents had already been caught in a war far greater than any battlefield. In the cathedrals of Spain, baptism was a sacred rite, a moment of rebirth, purity, salvation. In the Americas, it often came at the tip of a sword. The 1500s saw Christianity pushed not by soft sermons, but by sheer force. For many indigenous peoples, the cross was not offered, it was imposed. And those who resisted faced chains, flames, or death. To understand the violence of conversion, one must first understand its context. Spain's colonial empire was not only built on wealth, but on a promise to spread Christianity. This divine mission justified exploration, conquest, and control. Baptism became the entry point to the empire. If a native soul was baptized, it was saved. But if they rejected the rite, they were cast as infidels, unredeemable, dangerous, and disposable. In this twisted logic, violence became a form of salvation. Missionaries arrived on the heels of conquistadors, often escorted by soldiers. And while some truly believed in peaceful persuasion, the reality on the ground was stark. Entire villages were rounded up and forced to accept baptism. In some regions, children were taken from their parents and baptized in secret or en masse, their tears seen as spiritual cleansing. One example stands out: the forced mass baptisms in the Caribbean and Central America during the early colonial decades. Friars, working under pressure from colonial governors, baptized thousands of indigenous people in a single day, often without instruction, translation, or consent. These weren't conversions of the heart. They were bureaucratic rites, performed to count souls and justify funding from the Spanish crown. Some missionaries, such as Fray Toribio de Benavente, nicknamed Motolinia by the Nahua people, defended mass baptisms, believing speed was more important than sincerity. In contrast, others, such as Las Casas, condemned the practice, insisting that true faith could not be coerced. He wrote bitterly of priests baptizing terrified natives while soldiers still stood nearby, dripping with blood from the last raid. Worse still were the punishments for resisting conversion. In many colonial settlements, indigenous religious practices were banned outright. Temples were destroyed, idols were burned, sacred books were shredded. Entire cosmologies, deep, complex spiritual traditions were labeled devil worship. To pray to ancient gods was heresy. To keep old rituals was rebellion. Spanish friars often forced villagers to bring out their sacred items and burn them in public bonfires as a form of cleansing. The Inquisition, although more active in Europe, also had its shadowy influence in the colonies. Indigenous leaders accused of maintaining their old beliefs could be publicly flogged, branded, or imprisoned. Some were executed. In the Andes, after the fall of the Inca Empire, Spanish priests smashed golden idols and replaced them with crucifixes, a symbolic conquest of heaven as much as earth. But resistance simmered beneath the surface. In many regions, syncretism began to emerge, a hidden blending of Catholic symbols with indigenous meaning. Native peoples, rather than entirely rejecting their heritage, began to disguise their gods beneath the saints, their festivals under Catholic feasts. The Virgin Mary became linked to fertility goddesses. Catholic processions mirrored ancient rituals. It was not acceptance, but survival. Still, the physical violence was undeniable. In some areas, villagers were tortured until they agreed to baptism. In others, refusal meant death. Conquistadors would sometimes baptize prisoners just moments before executing them, believing that doing so would save the soul while eliminating the threat. It was salvation through slaughter, a profoundly symbolic moment occurred during the conquest of the Maya. In 1562, Bishop Diego de Landa, enraged by what he saw as backsliding into paganism, ordered the burning of Maya codices and sacred objects in the Yucatan. These books contained generations of history, astronomy, medicine, and spirituality. Only 4 codices survived. The rest became ashes. De Landa later tortured Maya nobles to force confessions of idol worship. Ironically, despite his brutality, he also recorded detailed accounts of Maya culture, preserving what he tried to destroy. Across the Americas, conversion by the sword left deep wounds. Christianity spread, yes, but often as a tool of empire, not of grace. And for many indigenous communities, it meant the erasure of identity. It's essential to acknowledge that not all conversions were coerced. Some indigenous people genuinely embraced Christianity. They found solace, strength, or power within the new religion. In some instances, Christianity was reinterpreted through native worldviews, leading to vibrant new expressions of faith. But these moments of agency existed within a system of oppression. By the late 1500s, the Spanish Empire had baptized millions across its American territories. On paper, the mission was complete. In reality, what remained was a continent scarred by forced faith, cultural annihilation, and spiritual confusion. The church towers rose high, but beneath them lay the ruins of 1,000 temples, the ashes of 1,000 gods, and the whispers of 1,000 resistances. The Spanish conquest of the Americas was not just a clash of armies or cultures. It was a triangle of power: the friars, the conquistadors, and the crown. Each believed they served a divine mission, but each also pursued a different vision of empire, and often they collided. At the top stood the Spanish crown, kings and queens cloaked in divine right, determined to expand their dominion. They financed voyages, issued decrees, and claimed lands they had never seen. Beneath the gilded ceilings of royal courts in Seville and Madrid, the conquest was drawn in ink. Maps, treaties, papal bulls. But these royal dreams meant nothing without men to enforce them. That's where the conquistadors came in. Brutal, ambitious, hungry for gold and glory. Men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro sailed west not to spread the gospel, but to enrich themselves. They cut deals, raised armies, and razed cities. For them, God's will was a convenient justification for plunder. And when they spoke of civilizing the natives, it was often a mask for enslavement. But the third pillar in this triangle, and perhaps the most complex, was the church. The friars were not soldiers. They didn't wield swords, but they had the power of the word, and they wielded it with fire. Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians, and Jesuits arrived in waves, each with their own methods, but shared a common mission: to save the souls of the Indians. Initially, these missions were closely tied to conquest. Many friars walked behind Spanish soldiers as they marched into new territories. Churches were built where temples once stood. Crosses were planted in fresh soil. Mass was read as smoke from burning idols curled into the sky. The church baptized the conquest, sanctified it, and in many cases, benefited directly. The Encomienda system, for example, was a royal grant of native labor to Spanish settlers. The crown claimed it was in exchange for religious instruction. But in reality, it became a system of brutal exploitation. Many friars looked the other way. Others actively participated. And some, like Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, became its most vocal critics. Las Casas had once owned an encomienda himself, but after witnessing the atrocities committed against the natives, the lashings, the massacres, the starvation, he renounced his claim and became a Dominican friar. His writings would shake the empire to its core. In his famous work, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, Las Casas accused the conquistadors of committing genocide in the name of Christ. He described villages burned to the ground, children thrown onto pikes, and priests blessing campaigns of slaughter. He condemned not just the men with swords, but the crown that permitted them and the church that stayed silent. And yet, even Las Casas was a man of his time. He argued that Africans should replace natives as enslaved people, a horrifying position which he later regretted. But it reveals the complicated moral logic of the era. Saving souls was paramount, even if it meant condemning bodies. Still, his writings forced the crown to respond. In 1542, under pressure from Las Casas and others, King Charles V issued the new laws. Reforms meant to end indigenous slavery and curb the worst abuses of the Encomienda. They were resisted fiercely by settlers in the Americas and were only partially enforced. But the laws marked the beginning of a shift, a recognition, however faint, that unchecked conquest was corrupting the empire's soul. Yet, conflict between the church and the conquistador continued. In New Spain, Mexico, friars accused colonial officials of exploiting converts. In Peru, Jesuits fought to protect native lands from settler encroachment. In the Caribbean, priests clashed with governors over forced labor. Often, missionaries found themselves defending the very people they had come to convert, not just from paganism, but from Spanish cruelty. And they paid the price. Some friars were expelled, others were ignored, a few were killed, but many stayed, walking the uneasy line between imperial power and spiritual truth. This tension bled into architecture, art, and law. Cathedrals were built by indigenous hands. Statues of saints looked out over plazas where whips once cracked. Legal debates raged in Spanish courts. Were natives fully human? Could they be enslaved? Should they be paid for their labor? These weren't abstract questions. They shaped policy, justified war, and defined life in the colonies. Over time, the lines blurred. Some conquistadors built churches. Some friars enslaved people. Some natives became priests. The triangle of power folded inward, creating a tangled web of interests, all under the banner of Spain. But beneath this complex system lay a simple truth. The conquest of the Americas was not just a military campaign. It was a spiritual war. And in that war, the friars, the conquistadors, and the crown each saw themselves as saviors, even as they left a trail of destruction in their wake. The mission system was Spain's most powerful tool for reshaping the New World, not just physically, but spiritually, linguistically, and culturally. It was not built with swords, though violence often surrounded it. It was built with stone, scripture, and silence, one indigenous identity at a time. Across Mexico, Central America, and the southwestern edges of North and South America, Spain's missionaries created vast networks of religious outposts, known as missions, to convert and civilize indigenous people. These were more than just churches. They were self-contained worlds, with chapels, workshops, barracks, schools, and dormitories for indigenous converts who were often relocated, renamed, and retrained. The logic behind the system was clear. If you could erase the native language, teach Spanish, baptize the soul, and impose Christian customs, you could mold entire generations into loyal subjects of the Spanish Empire. But this was not gentle assimilation. It was cultural erasure wrapped in divine justification. Young indigenous children were the primary targets. Taken from their families, they were taught to kneel, to cross themselves, to confess. They learned new names, spoke new words, and prayed to foreign gods. Indigenous languages were labeled demonic. Sacred dances were outlawed, and ancestral rituals were declared blasphemy. Even clothing became a tool of conquest. Traditional garments were replaced with Spanish tunics. Hairstyles were altered. Gender roles were redefined under European norms, and all of this was done under the banner of salvation. The Franciscan missionaries were especially fervent. In places like New Spain, modern-day Mexico, they organized mass baptisms, sometimes thousands in a single day, as if grace could be measured in volume. In California, 2 centuries later, Junipero Serra would become the poster figure for this approach, founding 21 missions across the coast, bringing Catholicism and Spanish control deeper into indigenous lands. He is revered by some, canonized by the Catholic Church. But many Native American communities remember him not as a saint, but as the man who helped destroy their world. Daily life inside a mission was strictly regimented. Indigenous converts, or neophytes, were expected to wake with the bell, pray, work, eat, pray again, and sleep, all on schedule. They farmed, built walls, tanned hides, made bricks, and sang hymns. The friars taught obedience, humility, and submission to Spanish rule, often enforced through corporal punishment. Escape was considered apostasy, and many tried to run. In regions like Paraguay, the Jesuits tried a different approach. They allowed some indigenous customs to survive, protected native languages, and organized Guarani communities into Christian republics with relative autonomy. For a time, these Jesuit missions became shining examples of a softer conquest. But even these more tolerant experiments still operated within the same colonial logic. Spain was the parent, the indigenous were the children, and obedience was non-negotiable. The mission system was also deeply tied to land appropriation. Missions claimed fertile valleys and riverbanks. Once the indigenous population had been resettled or died off, often from disease or overwork, these lands were absorbed into Spanish estates or towns. Some missions eventually evolved into cities. San Diego, San Francisco, and Los Angeles were all once Franciscan outposts. The spiritual conquest, it turned out, was also a real estate project. Resistance existed, but it wasn't easy. In many cases, indigenous people outwardly converted while secretly preserving their traditions. They whispered old songs, passed down ancestral knowledge, and hid sacred objects. In some cases, entire uprisings were sparked by mission brutality, such as the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, where indigenous leaders in present-day New Mexico coordinated a sweeping rebellion and drove out Spanish settlers for over a decade. But these victories were rare. Over time, the mission system succeeded in its core goal. It fractured indigenous continuity, severed cultural memory, and replaced it with a hybrid, part Spanish, part native, and deeply marked by trauma. Today, the ruins of many missions still stand. Some are revered as heritage sites. Others are seen as scars on the land. And the debate continues. Were the friars saviors or oppressors? Was the mission system a form of education or cultural genocide? The answer, like much of colonial history, lies in the gray. What's undeniable is this. The mission system didn't just bring religion to the New World. It became the architecture of empire, a silent machine of transformation, powered by faith, but driven by domination. And long after the swords were sheathed, the bells of the missions kept ringing, calling souls not only to prayer, but to forget who they once were. In the 1500s, as Spain tightened its grip on the New World, it needed more than ships and swords to justify the bloodshed. It needed theology. It needed a reason why burning villages, enslaving people, and dismantling civilizations could still serve a higher moral purpose. And so, it evolved into a powerful and terrifying concept: the just war. Rooted in Catholic doctrine and refined over centuries by thinkers like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, the concept of bellum justum, just war, gave rulers moral license to wage war only under specific conditions. If there was a grave offense, if peace had been tried and failed, and if the war aimed to restore justice or defend the innocent. But when Spain looked across the Atlantic, the lines between defense and domination blurred. Could a refusal to convert be considered a grave offense? Could the existence of heathen beliefs justify violence? For many Spanish theologians and conquistadors, the answer was yes. In 1511, on the island of Hispaniola, Dominican friar Antonio de Montesinos delivered a sermon that shook the Spanish conscience. He thundered at the colonists, "Are these not men? Do they not have rational souls? By what right do you wage such detestable wars against these people?" Montesinos was among the first to challenge the morality of conquest, declaring that no law, human or divine, permitted enslaving or killing the innocent. His words sparked a theological crisis. Suddenly, Spain had to reckon with its empire building in spiritual terms. The debate reached a fever pitch with the rise of Bartolomé de las Casas, a former encomendero who turned to the priesthood and dedicated his life to defending indigenous rights. In his writings, particularly a short account of the destruction of the Indies, Las Casas painted horrifying pictures: children burned alive, elders tortured, entire villages destroyed in the name of God and the king. He insisted the indigenous were rational beings. They had culture, law, spirituality, and therefore had to be treated as equals under Christian law. But Las Casas wasn't a revolutionary in modern terms. He still believed in converting natives, just through persuasion, not violence. And shockingly, at one point, he even proposed using enslaved Africans instead of indigenous labor, a suggestion he later regretted. His opponent in the Great Debate of 1550 was Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, a humanist and court scholar who argued that some people were natural slaves. Sepúlveda claimed that indigenous Americans were too barbaric to govern themselves, too irrational to choose Christianity willingly. He cited Aristotle to say that just as the soul rules the body, civilized Spaniards must rule over savages. Thus, wars of conquest were not only justified, they were necessary acts of moral guidance. This clash culminated in the famous Valladolid debate, the first major moral and legal examination of colonization in European history. Las Casas argued for indigenous humanity. Sepúlveda argued for Spanish superiority. There was no official verdict. But the implications were clear. Spain's soul was at war with itself. Even as these debates raged in intellectual circles, on the ground in the Americas, theology became a weaponized script. When indigenous leaders resisted baptism or clung to ancestral rituals, it was deemed rebellion, and thus cause for war. Spanish expeditions were framed as spiritual rescue missions, liberating souls from darkness, even if it meant massacring bodies. The Requerimiento, a bizarre legal document drafted in 1513, encapsulated this twisted logic. Before attacking a village, Spanish captains were supposed to read the Requerimiento aloud, often in Latin or Spanish, to people who understood neither, informing the natives that the Pope had granted their lands to Spain, and they must submit peacefully. If they refused or did not respond, war was justified. This legal fiction allowed for mass violence under the illusion of righteousness. But not all Spaniards accepted this moral gymnastics. Some missionaries defied orders. Some refused to baptize enslaved people. Others documented abuses in secret. Still, the theology of just war provided Spain with a moral cushion. The idea that its empire was a civilizing mission, not a conquest. That it was bringing salvation, not subjugation. Over time, this doctrine permeated colonial law, governance, and military policy. It justified everything from the seizure of lands to the suppression of indigenous uprisings. It also left a dangerous legacy: the notion that violence can be virtuous if your god or king demands it. Centuries later, that logic would resonate in other empires, wars, and justifications. In the Americas of the 1500s, it provided Spain with what it needed most: a holy justification for its unholy deeds. In the shadow of conquest, amidst burned temples and silenced tongues, faith didn't come with fire. It also came in whispers and in suffering. For many indigenous peoples, the choice was brutal: submit or die. But for others, faith was neither forced nor faked. It was adopted, adapted, and transformed. This chapter is not only about what Spain brought, but what the native peoples chose, reshaped, and sometimes even weaponized. By the mid-1500s, conversion efforts had taken root across the Spanish Americas. Missionaries, mostly Franciscans, Dominicans, and later Jesuits, spread across the landscape like a second wave of colonizers. But unlike the conquistadors, they came with crosses, not cannons. Yet their mission was no less radical. They aimed to dismantle entire cosmologies, to replace sun gods with saints, to rename rivers, cities, and even people. At the heart of this campaign were schools for indigenous children, often run by friars. These were not just religious institutions, they were factories of transformation. Boys learned Spanish, Latin, and Christian theology, while unlearning their native languages and traditions. Some, like the Franciscan Colegio de Santa Cruz in Tlatelolco, even produced indigenous scholars who wrote in Latin and debated theology with Spaniards. These students were seen as living proof that the so-called barbarians could become Christian gentlemen. But with this education came alienation. Converts often found themselves rejected by both worlds, distrusted by Spanish elites, and mourned by their own communities as lost souls. Still, there were true believers. Some indigenous converts embraced Christianity not as submission, but as survival, and even rebellion. Take the story of Juan Diego, a Nahua man who in 1531 claimed to witness the apparition of the Virgin Mary, but not as she was known in Spain. She appeared as a dark-skinned native woman, speaking Nahuatl, standing atop a hill sacred to the Aztecs. This vision, Our Lady of Guadalupe, would become one of the most potent religious symbols in Mexican history. To the Spanish clergy, it was a sign of divine approval. To indigenous people, it was something else: a holy bridge between two worlds. Mary had come to them, in their language, on their land. For centuries, Guadalupe would be venerated not just as a saint, but as a subtle form of resistance, a merging of faiths beneath the surface of orthodoxy. Elsewhere, martyrdom became a path to sanctity and control. In the 1590s, Jesuit missionaries in the borderlands of Florida and the southeastern U.S. wrote of their brutal deaths at the hands of native tribes. These stories were carried back to Spain, where the dead were hailed as martyrs of the faith. However, native perspectives were rarely preserved. Often, the violence had erupted after repeated abuses, forced relocations, or broken promises. The missionaries, though sincere in faith, were still part of an invasive system. In some cases, converts themselves were martyred, but not for Jesus, for defying Spanish cruelty. In Peru, Don Cristobal Choquehuanca, a noble Inca descendant and devout Christian, was executed in 1570 for leading a protest against colonial abuse. He died quoting the Bible, not as a rebel, but as a believer. His life raised a troubling question. Could one be truly Christian and oppose the empire? For the Spanish crown, the answer was no. For the oppressed, it became the only answer that mattered. And yet, despite the pain, something unexpected happened over generations: a fusion of belief. In Guatemala, the Rabin Ajao festival blended Catholic and Maya traditions, parading both saints and ancestral spirits. In Mexico, old gods were hidden behind Christian icons. In the Andes, processions of the Virgin Mary followed the paths once walked by Inca priests. This wasn't resistance in arms, it was spiritual rebellion, a quiet war of symbols and memory. Even the church itself began to reflect this hybrid world. Indigenous priests, though rare, began to emerge. Native language catechisms were printed, and in some towns, the rhythm of Catholic Mass pulsed with native drums. But the cost was heavy. The Church excommunicated entire villages for practicing syncretic rituals. Inquisitors arrived to investigate heretical mixing, and in many cases, the most devoted Christians were also the most vulnerable to persecution, expected to denounce their neighbors, renounce their roots, and pledge loyalty to a God who wore European robes. Still, faith endured in monasteries, forests, and homes. Not always as conquest demanded, but as the heart allowed, because for millions across the New World, faith was not simply imposed upon them. It was negotiated, endured, and in some cases, transformed into something that Spain could never fully control. The fires of faith did not remain in Spain. By the late 1500s, the Spanish Inquisition, one of Europe's most feared religious institutions, cast its long and chilling shadow across the Atlantic. What had begun as a tool to purify Spain's soul from heresy now followed colonists, missionaries, and officials into the Americas. The Church was no longer content with converting indigenous populations. It sought to monitor, police, and punish any deviation from Catholic orthodoxy, even among the converted. The Inquisition's reach arrived subtly at first. There were no torture chambers built into ships, no public burnings on the beaches. Instead, its methods crept in through bureaucracy. Letters between colonial officials and the Council of the Indies in Spain revealed growing concern over heresies in the colonies. Crypto-Jews hiding among settlers, blasphemous language in markets, and indigenous rituals lingering beneath a thin veil of Christianity. The empire's religious integrity, they claimed, was at risk. So, in 1570, the Holy Office of the Inquisition formally established its tribunal in Lima, Peru. Later, it opened another in Mexico City. From these two centers, inquisitors wielded spiritual and political power with terrifying precision. They monitored books, sermons, rumors, and dreams. No one, not Spaniards, mestizos, Africans, nor indigenous converts, was beyond suspicion. Unlike in Spain, the indigenous peoples were largely exempt from formal trial. The Church, in theory, believed that it lacked a complete theological understanding and thus could not commit actual heresy. But that did not mean they were safe. Converts were often accused of backsliding, of continuing to worship old gods in secret. Priests and informants accused communities of dancing under moonlight, of whispering prayers in native tongues, of hiding idols beneath church altars. For Afro-descended populations, especially those enslaved or recently freed, the Inquisition posed an even greater threat. African spiritual practices, from Yoruba traditions to Congo cosmologies, were labeled witchcraft. Drumming, chanting, and even herbal medicine could be deemed diabolical. Accusations led to imprisonment, forced confessions, or public humiliation in auto da fe ceremonies. Mass trials meant as moral theater. These performances of penance or punishment, often held in central plazas, reinforced Spanish religious dominance before the entire colony. The targets of the Inquisition were not just spiritual. Political dissidents, critics of colonial rule, and even priests who questioned the crown's treatment of natives could find themselves under suspicion. The line between heresy and rebellion was dangerously thin. Consider the case of Fray Diego de Landa, a Franciscan friar in Yucatan. In 1562, he led a campaign to eradicate Maya religious texts and idols, burning hundreds of sacred codices in a single act of cultural erasure. Yet, despite his zealotry, Landa himself was recalled to Spain and investigated by the Inquisition, not for being too lenient, but for overstepping moral authority. Even the most fervent defenders of the faith could find themselves caught in the system's grip. In the colony's social hierarchy, fear became an equalizer. A whisper from a jealous rival, a misinterpreted phrase, a forgotten ceremony. Any of these could trigger an inquiry. People altered their behavior, their speech, and their reading habits. Priests became informants. Neighbors betrayed neighbors. The Inquisition was not just an institution, it was a presence, a silent watcher behind every sermon, every confession, every ritual. Yet the Americas were vast. The Inquisition, despite its reputation, could not control every province. In remote frontiers, indigenous traditions persisted in quiet defiance. African beliefs evolved into syncretic religions, such as Santeria and Candomblé, blending Catholic saints with ancestral spirits and deities. Hidden resistance lived beneath the liturgy. Proof that faith, even when imposed, could be reshaped by the oppressed. Still, the message was clear. Conversion was not enough. The soul had to conform completely or risk punishment in both this life and the next. The Inquisition in the New World was not as bloody as in Spain, but it was no less suffocating. It brought with it a culture of fear, obedience, and silence that reshaped not only religious practice, but personal identity. In the name of purity, the colonists had imported suspicion. In the name of faith, they weaponized fear. And as the bells of the cathedrals tolled across the plazas of Mexico, Peru, and Cartagena, they did not always signal salvation. Sometimes they rang out as a warning. Someone had spoken out of turn, and the Holy Office was listening. In the ashes of burned idols and beneath the stone walls of new cathedrals, something unexpected was taking shape. The Spanish came with a mission: to destroy paganism and replace it with Catholicism. But the indigenous peoples of the Americas, from the Andes to Mesoamerica, were not empty vessels waiting to be filled. They were cultures with memory, with gods etched into stone and soil, and they did not forget. Even under Conquest, they reimagined. This quiet reimagining gave birth to a complex, layered belief system: religious syncretism, a fusion of Catholicism and native spirituality that neither the Church nor the Crown could fully control. It began subtly. When missionaries introduced saints, indigenous peoples saw not new divine beings, but reflections of their old gods. The Virgin Mary was venerated, yes, but to many, she resembled Tonantzin, the Aztec mother goddess, and on sacred hills where rain deities had once been worshipped, now stood chapels to St. James or St. John. The names had changed. The prayers were in Spanish or Latin, but the sacred geography remained intact. One of the most potent symbols of this blend came in 1531 with the appearance of Our Lady of Guadalupe. According to the story, a native convert named Juan Diego encountered a vision of the Virgin Mary on Tepeyac Hill, which was once the site of Tonantzin's temple. She spoke to him in Nahuatl, his native tongue, and requested that a church be built in her honor. The bishop doubted him, until Juan Diego returned with a cloak filled with roses, and the image of the Virgin was miraculously imprinted on the fabric. To the Spanish, it was divine confirmation of Mary's power in the New World. To the indigenous, it was something more. She had appeared not as a European woman, but as a brown-skinned figure with native features. Her message came in the language of the conquered. Her presence did not erase the past. It stood atop it. From that moment, Guadalupe became not only a symbol of Catholic devotion, but also a quiet rebellion against complete erasure. She embodied dual identities, sacred to both Spanish priests and native peoples. Her shrine became the most visited religious site in the Americas. But syncretism went beyond saints and visions. In highland villages, old gods were remembered by new names. Catholic feast days were blended with pre-Columbian rituals. Indigenous dancers performed ancient steps in church festivals, wearing crosses and feathered headdresses alike. In Andean communities, the Inti Raymi, Festival of the Sun, was rebranded under Christian calendars, but it still honored the power of light and the harvest. Even the architecture reflected this duality. Spanish churches built atop native temples used stones taken from destroyed pyramids. The physical foundations of indigenous belief were literally incorporated into the structures meant to suppress them. This was not submission, it was survival. Priests noticed. Many grew frustrated. They wrote letters home complaining that the Indians attended Mass but still offered food to mountain spirits, that they confessed sins with one breath and called on ancestral gods with the next, that their children learned the catechism while wearing amulets under their tunics. However, despite their efforts, the syncretic faith continued to spread. Enslaved Africans, too, brought with them spiritual systems that merged with Catholicism. In Spanish colonies like Cuba, Yoruba deities often took on the guise of Catholic saints. Shango became Saint Barbara. Elegua mirrored Saint Anthony. In rituals known as Santeria, practitioners recited Hail Marys while honoring Orishas with drums and offerings. Enslaved people preserved their cosmology beneath the rosary's rhythm. This layered spirituality offered comfort, protection, and resistance. It was faith reshaped to fit chains, to survive genocide, to whisper the old names through the hymns of the conqueror. For the Church, this was a theological compromise, sometimes tolerated, often condemned. But for indigenous and Afro-descended peoples, it was a way to retain identity in a world that sought to erase them. By the end of the 16th century, Christianity in the New World did not look like the Christianity of Castile. It rang with native drums, danced with pre-Columbian steps, and bore the colors of two worlds braided together. It was not the faith the Spaniards had intended to impose. It was the faith that the conquered had redefined. And in this redefinition, they claimed a sliver of power, of continuity, of sacred memory. Not in resistance through violence, but in resistance through remembrance. The priests are gone now, the conquistadors too. But the questions they left behind still echo in the lands they claimed to save. What happens when belief is born in conquest? What does salvation look like when it rides in on a horse, armed and armored? In the wake of the Spanish conquest and centuries of colonization, religion became both the sword and the salve. It tore down temples and built cathedrals in their place. It baptized nations in holy water and blood alike. But it also lingered, long after the violence dulled, as a deeper, more permanent force. In many parts of Latin America today, Christianity is the dominant religion, with Catholicism being the most prevalent. But it is not simply Spanish Catholicism. It is something else, something hybrid, something born in fire, reshaped in silence, and carried forward in ritual and memory. Walk through Mexico City, Lima, or Quito, and you'll find grand churches built atop old empires. Beneath the altars lie the stones of Tenochtitlan, Cusco, and Cahokia. Above them, paintings of saints and martyrs. Below are the gods whose names have been forgotten by history, but not by the land. This coexistence of past and present is not peace. It is a negotiation. For many indigenous communities, the Church represents both historical trauma and spiritual refuge. The missionaries of the 16th century destroyed sacred codices, outlawed native languages, and punished traditional healers as witches. But they also provided literacy, medical care, and sometimes protection from brutal Encomienda masters. The paradox remains. Many of today's indigenous Catholics carry crosses and recite prayers in their native languages, Quechua, Nahuatl, and Aymara, languages that survived in the margins, even when the Church insisted on using Latin or Spanish. Their faith is not one of passive acceptance, but of survival. They kept what they could, adopted what they had to, and built something uniquely their own. And what about the enslaved Africans brought to the New World? They arrived in chains, stripped of names, lands, and gods. Yet they too carried something resilient: their cosmologies, their rituals, Their ancestral spirits found cracks in the colonial walls. In Cuba, Brazil, Haiti, and beyond, Christianity was integrated into traditions such as Santeria, Candomblé, and Vodou, syncretic religions that honored both saints and spirits. These belief systems were not mistakes or misunderstandings. They were acts of spiritual resistance. They said, "You may own our bodies, but not our souls." The colonial legacy of faith is, at its heart, a story of identity. For the Spaniards, Catholicism was a tool of empire, a way to unify, control, and justify domination. For the colonized, it became a double-edged inheritance, at once a symbol of destruction and a means of survival. Theologians, historians, and philosophers continue to debate the Church's role in colonialism. Was it complicit? Was it protective? Was it both? Some priests defended indigenous peoples, like Bartolomé de las Casas, who spoke out against slavery and cruelty, calling it a destruction of the Indies. And some priests blessed the conquest, who saw the natives as heathens to be broken, not saved. Even today, that divide remains. In schools, textbooks recount the stories of missionaries who brought light to darkness. But in communities still struggling with poverty, marginalization, and land theft, the Church's light feels dim. Churches are sometimes symbols of wealth, towering over the descendants of the dispossessed. Yet faith persists. Pilgrimages to sites like Guadalupe or Copacabana draw millions each year. These are not just Catholic celebrations. They are expressions of culture, ancestry, and belonging. They carry stories older than the Gospels and deeper than doctrine. Colonialism sought to erase those stories. It failed. Because memory is resilient, because belief is not easily commanded, and because the people of the Americas, Indigenous, African, Mestizo, found ways to bend the imposed faith into something that could carry their own truths. Ultimately, religion in the New World evolved into more than just a tool of empire. It became a mirror, reflecting conquest, resistance, loss, and hope. It tells us who ruled, but also who refused to be ruled completely. It tells us what was imposed, and what survived despite that. The crucifix and the feather, the rosary and the drum, the sermon and the chant, all still echo in the Americas, not as the voice of Spain, but as the voice of the people who endured, adapted, and remembered.